defined as the changes that have occurred in the world around us as a result of the implementation and deployment of digital technology. And during my address, I actually gave a number of digital technology introductions or inflection points from the area of electronics, telecommunications, as well as computers that I believed had a significant effect on digital transformation. However, I left out two emerging technologies, although I touched on one. The one is the Internet of Things, and the other one is, of course, 5G. Again, in very simple terms, the Internet of Things is basically where we will start connecting devices. Some of these will be appliances that are already in our lives. Others will be sensors that we'll embed into our environment. And the purpose of this is to connect them to a communications network so that we're able to source information. So those devices will then form sensors, or to actually control the environment in which we're in. One of the generic use cases of 5G, and that's the next generation cellular technology, is the ability to connect masses of devices. In fact, we're talking about having the ability, the standards actually define this, having the ability to connect up to 1 million devices per square kilometer. So 5G will actually become, besides the other performance improvements that it will add to our lives, will actually become one of the main objectives, or one of its main objectives is to drive the connection of the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things in the future will drive the way our cities are created and operated and managed. And that has led us to the concept of smart cities, which is actually the topic for tonight's lecture. One of the aspects that I believe is strongly entrenched in digital transformation is the fact that when we look at these use cases in the future, the majority of them will be associated with the need to use multidisciplinary teams. And with that in mind, tonight's lecture is not going to be presented by an electrical engineer. It's actually going to be presented by an architect. And so I would like to take this opportunity of warmly welcoming Professor Chrisna Du Plessis, who's going to talk to us tonight about smart cities within the developing economy, looking at the promises and the pitfalls. Just a brief CV. Chrisna Du Plessis is Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Architecture, as well as holding the chair of the built environment at the School of the Built Environment at the University of Pretoria. Before joining the university, she was a principal researcher at the CSIR. Professor Du Plessis holds graduate and postgraduate degrees in architecture as well as sustainable development from the University of Pretoria, a PhD in urban sustainability from the University of Salford, from whom she also received an Alumni Achievers Award, and an honorary doctorate from Chalmers University in Sweden. Professor Du Plessis is leader of the Priority Theme Sustainable Construction Chair, as well as chair of the Program Committee of the Board of the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction. She's also a member of the International Standards Organization, Working Group on Resilience of Buildings and Civil Engineering Works, and serves on the editorial boards of the journals Smart and Sustainable Built Environment, as well as Sustainable Earth. She has further served as a juror for the Lafarge Wholesome Foundation Sustainable Building Competition, which was held in the MEA region in June 2011 and 2017, as well as the European Solar Decathlon, which was held in 2011 and 2014. Her research concentrates on developing the principles and guiding frameworks for the practices of smart and sustainable construction and human settlements development, with a focus on resilience and regeneration, She has applied this body of work that has spanned the fields of housing, construction, industry, performance, urban human settlements, development, and infrastructure design. She has recently published Designing for Hope, Pathways for Regenerative Sustainability, which was awarded the AfriSAM SAIEE Award for Innovation in Sustainability in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Chrisna Du Plessis.
I always wanted to come in by other meetings. I never make these things big enough, so bear with us. So, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you here. It's fantastic to see that somebody actually pitched up for this. I'm quite impressed, especially in the cold of Johannesburg. And I would particularly like to thank Mr. Debo, the President of the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers, and Professor Meyer from the University of Johannesburg, and whoever else may be here that considers himself an important person. So thank you very much for this very prestigious invitation, and I only hope that I can live up to your expectations. So, in 1886, the Swedish physicist and Nobel laureate Franz Arrhenius published a paper in which he warned the world that the increasing carbon concentrations in the atmosphere as a result of burning of the fossil fuels by the fledgling second industrial revolution will eventually lead to atmospheric warming. And while now he is known as the father of climate change science, he was largely ignored by a world that had already fallen in love with the possibilities of cheap energy and the technological advances that that brought. So almost 100 years later, the oil company Exxon set up its own research program to investigate the link between carbon emissions from fossil fuels and climate change. And they built fairly rigorous and scarily accurate climate models. The findings of these studies recently became available thanks to things like WikiLeaks, and clearly showed that Exxon and other oil companies were very much aware of the possible impact of increased carbon emissions on the global climate. In July 1978, Exxon's senior scientist James Black warned a management committee that doubling the CO2 gases in the atmosphere would increase average global temperatures by 2 or 3 degrees, a number that is almost exactly in consensus with the scientific consensus of today. And how did the oil industry respond to this? Well, the first thing they did was to pump millions of dollars into climate denial. Currently, fossil fuel industries spend over $900 million per year in the USA alone to fund lobbyists and think tanks who sell functionalities to cast doubt on climate change science. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report on the impacts of average global warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this report was mainly published to convince policymakers about the necessity of limiting average global warming to below the scientifically proposed maximum safe level of 1.5 degrees Celsius, instead of the politically negotiated and very controversial Paris Climate Accord target of 2 degrees Celsius. Now, while the global average may only reach this level of warming between 2030 and 2050, many places in the world are already experiencing warming above that. In South Africa, the warming we experience, or the warming we experience, it's double the global average, and we've already shifted into a 2-degree warmer new normal. So if you thought this is a particularly hot summer and a very light winter, you were perfectly correct. The worst aspect of this IPCC report is that it gives the world less than 12 years to reduce CO2 emissions with 45% from 2010 levels if we want to have a 50% chance of keeping below that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. It further requires that we achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and that we immediately, through very drastic measures start to remove the carbon that is already in the air and in the oceans, and we need to remove at least 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, despite all of this, global emissions continue to rise with about 2% a year. It's clear that our window of opportunity to choose between a warm but livable planet or a planet that will become uninhabitable is starting to close. Given that the IPCC is notoriously conservative and its reports have consistently underestimated the pace and degree of climate change, and that our society remains locked into patterns of consumption and production which increase our existential risk at many levels, environmental scientists are starting to talk about the very real possibility of near-term societal collapse and possible human extinction. They've also stopped self-censoring, finally being scared enough to speak truth to power, feeling that in the greater scheme of things, the academic careers will in any case disappear as civilization starts collapsing around us. In July 2017, a conversation that climate scientists usually confine to dinner parties after quite a few glasses of wine burst into the mainstream when David Wallace Wells published an article in The Intelligencer asking, when will the Earth be too hot for humans? Given that we have a very, very slim chance to even meet the 2 degree Celsius target set by the Paris Climate Accord. Wallace Wells' paper inspired Jen Bendel, who is a professor of sustainability leadership at the University of Pretoria, to take a sabbatical to explore the latest climate change. And the result was a paper that Vice magazine calls the climate change paper so depressing it's sending people to therapy. And what makes this paper so depressing is that the real science, outside of the very carefully hedged and politically approved language of the IPCC reports, very clearly points towards the real possibility of large-scale ecological and social systems collapse in the next decade or two, if we're lucky, and quite possibly human extinction by the end of the century. This paper inspired the school strike by Greta Thunberg, who has now spread to cover almost 2,000 locations around the world, as well as the rapidly growing global protest movement, the Extinction Rebellion, who are currently lobbying for the declaration of ecocide as a crime against humanity, amongst other things. The response from politicians across the world was to further push investment into developing fossil fuels. In the United States, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord and is doing his best to stop all climate research. In Australia, the CSIRO's climate research wing was closed down, and the government continues to sell ecological areas and farmlands to Adani for further coal mining. And in South Africa, our government continues to push coal, sees mining as a sunrise industry, has opened the door to fracking, and see the newly discovered Brolpadal gas field as our economic savior. Now you might ask why I open a talk about smart cities by talking about the trajectory of climate change science. The reason is that it holds several cautionary tales for us for our engagement for what we are now calling the fourth industrial revolution, of which smart cities becomes a component. We see how our excitement with the possibilities of new technologies led us to ignore the warnings of scientists until it was far too late. We see how an industry stands together to fund denial instead of finding ways to mitigate the impact of that industry and send it on a safer course. And we see that we cannot trust politicians and captains of industry to keep us safe and save us from our own short-sighted greed and stupidity. It is a reminder that our current love affair with the fourth industrial revolution needs to be tempered by the very real possibility that all the systems required to make it work may very well collapse in the next few decades. But most importantly, the trifecta of climate change, a level of ecosystem loss that scientists are already calling the sixth great extinction, and pervasive pollution by the residues of the second and third industrial revolutions and the lifestyles they enable, is creating an unfamiliar and a largely unknowable world in which the cities of our future will have to function. And it's a future that is looking increasingly bleak and dystopian. The ultimate aim of smart cities should be to help us deal with this unpredictable world, to help us adapt to these changes and avoid the worst of what is to come. But before we can consider how cities in developing economies can and must adapt to this new abnormal, and what we mean with smart cities in this context, we also need to understand the particular urban challenges that these cities face. When we talk about the problems of developing country cities, and I'm going particularly to focus on African cities, we see the same issues continue to surface. We lack access. We don't have control over access. We don't have control over things like land and other resources. We see growing poverty and inequality. We see issues around service delivery, and we see a distinct lack of integrity in our leadership. Now, if we look at our cities, the World Bank has said that African cities in particular have these three characteristics. They're crowded, they're full of people, too many people who are then forced into informal ways of living and livelihoods. They're disconnected in the sense that they're so spread out, it's coming from one side to the other costs you a lot of money, so a lot of people struggle to move around in these cities. And they are very costly to live in. And while urban poverty has shown a decline in African cities and a rise in some developed countries, the urban population explosion means that there are more poor people living in cities, while access to opportunities still remain in the hands of the elite class. And while the UN Habitat World Cities report stated that 75% of cities across the world have become more unequal over the past 2 decades, people may have become wealthier in very tiny little normative means. We're talking about moving from $1.2 a day to $2 a day. Which means also that because of the cost of infrastructure and delivering services in these cities, very few people have access to a full range of services. And then where there are services, we are struggling with things like our crumbling infrastructure. Most African cities suffer from very dodgy infrastructure, to use a good scientific term. Our grid energy supply is unstable, not just in South Africa. Infrastructure cannot be put in place fast enough to deal with the backlogs because of this growing population. So drinking water is often a luxury, and existing infrastructure collapses under the demand and the lack of maintenance. And then we have political leadership and the ideologies that they espouse that leaves much to be feared for our future. It's not a pretty picture, and there's a lot of challenges that sits in this without the added challenge of climate change already. Now, these are all issues that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals attempt to address. The question that we are asking is, can smart cities contribute? And the answer is absolutely. When William Mitchell published his book Utopia in the last year of the previous century, he envisioned lean green cities that work smarter, not harder. Mitchell's Utopia became the inspiration of what came to be called smart cities. This has grown into a smart city narrative in which technology is used to empower community networks, to monitor equal access to urban infrastructure, or scale up more sustainable forms of living. We therefore see that the initial impulse behind smart cities is and remain the use of ICT to address real-world social, economic, and environmental problems, and not necessarily to create a computer for living in that will make already comfortable lives easier and more entertaining. Smart cities therefore could play a crucial role in meeting sustainable development goals and improving the resilience of our cities. And the explosion of books and conferences exploring African smart cities highlight many of these possibilities. The integration of information technology with infrastructure, architecture, everyday objects, and even our bodies open up many possibilities to optimize service delivery and resource use, to facilitate bottom-up self-organization and democratic participation through digital communication platforms. Sensors and cameras and monitoring networks alert us to dangers. Smart grids and the Internet of Things allow us to optimize energy use and streamline logistics. Social media communities allow more participative forms of governance and greater democracy. So there are numerous smart city opportunities that can be adapted or developed to work for the particular conditions in African cities. And I'm sure that you have many of your own ideas. I have a few examples to put forward as well. Say, for example, you live in an informal settlement and you need to call emergency services, or you need to direct a friend to your house, or simply want to order a pizza. So how do you direct people to a place where there are no real streets and no formal street addresses? And Africans are incredibly ingenious, and in Ghana they've developed this app called Snoo Code, and there's another similar app that's called What3Word. And what they do is to generate a simple code that you can use to direct your visitors to your current coordinates. And this code that you develop can then also be used as an address that you can provide when you're doing RICA or FICA at the bank, or when you need to have a fixed address for some reason or another. So this is a very good example of where smart technologies really come to the fore to help the poorest of the poor in ways that will make a huge difference to their lives. Another example, and I think it's the one that we are most focused on, is that of transport. So you're in a new town, you're going to a new place in your own town, and you want to figure out how to get there using public transport. Now, in the olden days of the previous century, really efficient cities would provide you with a map like this, which is the old London map that shows you all the different bus routes, codes for the different bus stops, and then at the bus stop there would be a sign that tells you what the bus schedule is. And using this, it's perfectly easy, if you're old enough and you understand how these things work, to navigate your way around things. So many years ago, I taught English in Istanbul. It's a job that required that I use public transport to travel across a mega city that's spread over 2 continents. And I needed to visit clients in their offices. So despite my very rudimentary grasp of Turkish, I actually managed to find my way around using my trusty A to Z of Istanbul and a lot of patience. Now, you just put in where you want to go in Google Maps, and it tells you exactly where the next bus or train is and where to go. This also works in Cairo and Casablanca, as I can attest. Just don't try it in South Africa. We're not actually there yet. I don't think we've actually entered the 3rd revolution, industrial revolution yet. Most of these methods of navigation work because there's an underlying structure, there's a logic. There are designated routes with designated stops and buses with numbers that's associated with these routes who follow a set schedule. Now you know that where we live, the situation is quite different. And in many African cities, things are more fluid and unstructured. Our public transport is largely self-organizing. The taxi leaves when it's full, and it can decide to deviate from a route if a customer requires a little side trip and is prepared to pay. It does not follow the rules of the road, and it stops anyway. We all know the scenario. Now, this is a nightmare for any system that requires consistency. But I think machine learning and artificial intelligence, combined with real-life route tracking of your ride, like you get for Uber, can make what is a seemingly chaotic and mysterious system available to many more potential passengers if we can only get the taxi industry to adopt it. Something else that is really now starting to come to the fore is this idea of the cashless society. The banks around the globe are trying to convince us that cash is no longer king. So being able to receive money and pay for anything from the use of a public toilet to your monthly utility bills without cash or even a bank card is very useful. It allows pensioners to receive their pensions without having to stand in long queues, out-of-pocket students can get a quick cash injection from daddy or mommy or a friend for that unexpected bill. Waiters don't have to carry so much change, and banks can cut the security and personnel costs. I think that's actually why they're introducing it. So there are some drawbacks to this though. Now, using your cell phone or your bank card to pay for a public toilet is a normal occurrence in Sweden. Strangers it may seem to us to pay for a public toilet. But I discovered that my 10 kroner use of the facilities came with a very hefty transaction fee. And it made me think twice about why banks are pushing us in this direction and who will end up paying. But transaction fees are the least of our concerns. A far larger concern is how vulnerable this is making not just the economy, but the individual to the collapse of energy systems. In South Africa, we've learned to roll with the punches, but when Venezuela recently experienced an 8-day-long national blackout, the dangers of moving all economic transactions and cash assets into an electronic platform became very clear very quickly. So I want to go back to those lessons that we learned from climate change and ask, what can go wrong? Look, imagine a city where all transactions are digital and cash no longer exists, where all communications happen over the internet and there's no post office anymore, where artificial intelligence regulates the movement of autonomous vehicles, the distribution of energy through the smart grid, the temperature in your home and delivery of your groceries, where your smartphone broadcasts your movements and preferences to all who may pay for such information, where your email provider not only reads all your mail, but owns all the data you transmit through any of its services. And if you use Gmail, that's exactly what is happening. Where surveillance and facial recognition technology follow you wherever you go. Now imagine what will happen in the event of a collapse of the energy grid, or if a hacker accesses your data, or the artificial intelligence system controlling transport for your home security is hacked, or goes on the blitz like computers do. You find suddenly you're met with the Microsoft blue screen of death. Or a society where you find yourself living in a fascist police state where every citizen is obliged to implant a microchip which tracks every movement and transaction. Now these are not speculative scenarios. They are already part of our reality. In 2017, hackers operating from Iran targeting hospitals, state agencies, city governments, and municipalities in the USA shut down the city of Alabama's municipal systems, the port of San Diego in California, a number of large hospitals and the University of Calgary, causing millions of dollars of damage in 45 US states. In 2015, a cyber attack on Ukraine's power grid left 250,000 people without electricity. So while we are making our cities more efficient with all the smartness, we are also making them much more vulnerable. And then Minority Report has become a reality. This is an image from a Dutch group, FARC. Those of you on the Afrikaans will understand what's so funny about it. Who have developed exactly that Minority Report. I don't know if you've seen the movie. The ability to predict who will commit a crime. You don't even have to have committed the crime. Software will predict it. Now, 11 years ago, I sat down in front of a camera at the Future Cities exhibition in Manchester's Cube Museum. And within 5 minutes of taking my photograph, a computer could tell me exactly where I have been in the past 48 hours, using the city's ubiquitous surveillance cameras. Google and Facebook listen in on my conversations and make advertising suggestions based on keywords collected, and it's getting to the point where I deliberately say strange things to see what Google comes up with. And the metadata from my messages and emails are sold to companies who use it to target me for robotic telephone sales, and I'm not just talking about the DM. By placing our lives online, almost nothing is private anymore. We should be a lot more scared than we are. When we can be accused of a crime before it has even been committed, based on a computer algorithm, When governments can insist you allow them access to your social media accounts when you enter the country, like the United States does. When there is no safe space left in which to utter a politically incorrect opinion or critique the government, we are at the mercy of the rising tide of tyrants and dictators. China is already using big data to control their citizens through a social credit system based on their antisocial behaviours, such as jaywalking. And Australia is developing their own version. I always know that Australians are actually a police state. We are entering a world of total social control, enabled by our smart cities. And as Orwell predicted, we are doing this to ourselves. And speaking of warnings, we should perhaps heed the warnings from climate change and listen to what the scientists are telling us now about our newest, greatest and latest fantastic technology of 5G. Recent years have seen considerable medical research published which highlights serious concerns about the health impact of living in what constitutes electromagnetic smog. A paper published last year in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet asked what would be the effect of the unprecedented human exposure to radio frequency electromagnetic radiation from conception until death that has been occurring in the past 2 decades. The authors evaluated over 2,200 studies, including in vitro, in vivo studies in human, animal, and plant experimental systems, and population studies, and found that 68% of studies have demonstrated significant biological or health effects associated with exposure to anthropogenic electromagnetic fields. These effects include autoimmune responses and changes to the brain metabolism and electrical activity in the brain, DNA damage and increased risk of cancer. Most of this research did not consider the much higher radiation levels of 5G technologies that underpins this Internet of Everything that makes all these wonderful visions of future smart cities possible. Earlier this year, Brussels, Geneva and Rome halted the rollout of 5G until more research on the potential health impacts has been done. And maybe they were very wise. Considering that we have no idea what the long-term cumulative impact of EMF radiation is on living organisms, this warning should not be taken lightly. This is our Svanten Arrhenius. Then we also have to ask ourselves whether we'll be able to keep those gigs flowing. And these very technologies that can be so helpful in identifying risks and manage disasters can themselves negatively impact on a city's resilience and increase its vulnerability to disaster and to other disruptions. First, there is the increasing dependence on energy, particularly electricity, to complete the simplest of tasks. And all smart city technologies use energy to power devices and crunch data, and much of it is reliant on the grid. In most developed cities, the power grid is old and already failing, and we do not know what the impact of this increased burden on the grid will be. In developing cities like ours, the grid is disappearing into the great black hole of the copper trade. And we also don't know when it falls over. Then there is also the question of the trade-off between the energy costs of processing power and the benefits of mining all this wonderful data that we now want to use in our big data projects, let alone the contribution of all of this energy to climate change. Cisco predicts that by the end of 2019, the Internet of Things will generate more than 500 zettabytes per year in data. So 1 zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes. While global cloud IP traffic will reach 19 zettabytes, or in the region of 1.6 zettabytes per month by the end of 2021. And those numbers are expected to grow exponentially year on year, not linearly. Now, considering that the transfer of 1 gigabyte of data over the internet uses approximately 5.12 kilowatt hours per gigabyte, this translates into quite a hefty carbon footprint, which has been calculated at some stage at about 27 kilograms of CO2 emissions for every gigabyte. So, going technology and going digital is not necessarily going to save the world. In 2015, the world's data centers we're already responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which is about the same as the airline industry. And this is continuing to grow as the Internet of Things expand. But we should not just worry about what the impact of all this wonderful smart technology is on climate change. We should also start thinking about whether we are ready for the impact of climate change on all our wonderful data centers, our smartphones, and all those devices. So we should ask ourselves, what impact will warmer temperatures have on our ability to keep this big data flowing as the electromagnetic spectrum reduces as the temperatures rise, and smart devices don't function at high ambient temperatures as they discovered last year in the Middle East. So we have all these fantastic and beautiful ideas about smart cities of the future. But aren't we perhaps fooling ourselves? Aren't we missing something? Aren't we deliberately putting something where we don't want to look at it? I see the ICT industry and its relentless pursuit of the fourth industrial revolution. I see in them the same blindness that I observe in the human geographers of the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, who predict that by 2050 the world's urban population will have doubled, with most of that growth in India, China, and Nigeria. A recent study by Ontario University predicts that by 2050 the largest cities in the world will be Mumbai, Delhi, Dhaka, and Kinshasa, with Lagos number 6 and Cairo coming in at number 11. By 2075, Kinshasa will top the list, with Lagos coming in 3rd and Dhaka at number 6, with a measly population of 46 million people. By the end of the century, they predict, the top 3 cities will be African, Lagos leading the pack with a population of 88 million, followed by Kinshasa and Dar es Salaam. Nowhere in these predictions and in these models is there any indication that all these warnings around climate change that I presented at the beginning of the lecture was even considered. But already we are starting to see major displacement as a result of natural weather-related disasters. And all climate models tells us that by the end of the century, Dakar will be under a meter of water, and the DRC, where Kinshasa is, will be too hot for human habitation. So we continue to have this disconnect between the various spheres in which we work. And that is leading us to make erroneous conclusions about the directions we should take for the future. And the really scary thing is that if we continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere at our current rates, by the end of the century, most of Africa and the world will not be habitable for humans and for many other species. So, how realistic are our future visions of cities? And how appropriate are they for the cities of Africa, even as they are today? Are we even thinking about what the cities will look like outside this kind of matrix world that we decided to delve in and disappear in? And perhaps, as some of the richer people in the world are thinking about doing, is to eventually just download your consciousness into robots and continue like this, because robots don't need food. I don't know how high temperatures they can continue to deal with that. But the thing is that climate change is going to force us to rethink what being a city will be, and how we deal smartly with the future of our cities. As I've now pointed out, there were a number of promises that all this technology brings, and some really good things. But we have to be very careful about what we do with this resource, that we don't misspend it, that we don't misuse it, because there's a lot of pitfalls as well. And we also need to ask ourselves, where are we going? If the whole world will have to start moving as climate change, what is our idea of city? Is it still this fixed object or this fixed organism that keeps on growing and growing? Or is it becoming like those early caricatures of archigram, something that where we revert to our nomadic roots, but we take our shells with us in wonderful machines. But perhaps if we don't do anything, the best we can hope for is to survive like our nomadic ancestors without any of our technological trappings. I hope that we are able to find a path in between, a path where we can find an appropriate level of smart with a character that belongs to this continent and its cultures. We study history so that we do not have to repeat the mistakes of the future. And while the fourth industrial revolution has much to offer, we should learn from the story of climate change and consider very carefully what dreams we chase and where we invest our time and resources. Considering that it is the cities of the developing world that will bear the brunt of climate change, we should perhaps consider to jump straight into the fifth industrial revolution, in which the judicious use of ICT helps us not just to adapt to change, but also to regenerate the world. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, my vision of where we need to go with smart cities. Thank you.
Good, thank you. A really thought-provoking lecture, I'm sure you will agree. I'm going to allow some questions. This is a technical lecture. I don't know if we have a roving mic. This is a rather big auditorium to be able to speak. Do we have a roving mic that we could perhaps use? All right, so I can't see what's happening with the lighting in front of me, but I'll try and see. Do we have any questions?
You're also shocked.
Thank you. Thank you for a very, I would say, scary situation that you portrayed to us. I came here, I think the expectation was somewhat different. Embracing technology, but it was a fear factor that was set out from the outset, just as a comment. I've been recently to Rwanda, and I was amazed. My perception of Rwanda was nothing but what my experience was. And to see one of the cleanest cities and greenest cities in Africa right in front of me, and enjoying the actual environment was something that I will always cherish. But the beauty of it is that there's no talk of the smart city or anything sophisticated. People are living in peace and happiness, and it seems to be, I would say, something of the future for them, and not, whereas the first world is moving to 5G, and we're talking about a different situation. I've been to the foot of the mountain, Mount Elbrus, where you see a community that lives in the foot of the mountain, and they're in peace, they live off the mountain, with no technology, no TV, etc., and happiness permeates throughout. I just want to know what's your view on this, because there seems to be a disconnect where you got the robotics, the high technology, where countries are moving ahead of the pack, and now there's a war zone between the US and China on 5G and how the debate who launches it. We all know the good things about these technologies, but there's always the other side of the story. I just would like to hear your views. I portray different scenarios, a community that's happy, no technology, moving to Rwanda where there is technology, but not the sophisticated technology yet. And then of course we're talking about the new revolution.
Well, my grandfather always said that just because you can do something, you shouldn't necessarily do it. And that's pretty much the way that I feel about the direction that a lot of this Western technology is going. You know, Europe, we're chasing things just because we can. It's like all these people climbing Mount Everest, walking over dead people, just so they can be able to say, I did it. And I think it's part of the sickness of our world, is that somewhere along the line we've been convinced that the only progress happens through technology and not through this kind of building of community, of finding that level of where you can live a comfortable life, where you can have time to be happy. And you have the level of technology that will keep you healthy and that maybe help you to connect to others. But you're not constantly chasing the newest and the latest and the improvements. And I know for engineers that's a very difficult concept perhaps, because that's part of what you do is to innovate, to come up with new things. But I also think there's a lot of innovation that can happen within that sphere of finding that comfortable middle ground that will keep us within the operating parameters, or the safe operating parameters of the planet, and that will help us to heal what we have so far pulled apart. And I think that's where Rwanda is actually quite a good example of walking out from something that was an absolutely horrific scenario, a societal collapse of their own, and how they managed, and with various degrees of success I hear also, but they've managed to rebuild, to regenerate and weave themselves into something that is much more than what they was, and that has built that level of happiness and peace. So I think as much as we want to blame technology, we also need to start thinking about the stories that we tell ourselves about how much technology we need and what technologies we need to pursue. I hope that answers your question.
Other questions? Other one over there.
Greetings, thanks for the wonderful presentation. Just wanted to find out, so you talked about access and control to cities. What's your standpoint with regards to the e-tolling system? What is your stand with regards to the e-tolling system?
I think it's highway robbery.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You had a slide where you spoke about SNU, where you could identify your location wherever you are. So Google Maps also has that feature. It's called plus code. If any of you use Google Maps, you can see that any location, if you don't have a street address, Google Maps will generate for you a plus code, which is a reusable international global thing. That's not questions.
Professor, you talked about the significant increase in data rates and data connectivity in the future, which we know is exponential, and is driven by things like video, mainly, having a significant impact on carbon footprint. But that's assuming, of course, that in the future, the majority of our energy is going to be generated using fossil fuels. Have you not considered the work and the move towards renewables and what impact that will have?
I think it's a really good question, and I know that a lot of the data centers are starting to look at that. I mean, Google has got one of the largest renewable powered data centers in the world. China is also starting to look at it, particularly once they realize that we continue to mine Bitcoin, it will within the next year or two eat up the entire energy production of the planet. So I think there is opportunity to do that, and if we can get that kind of, if we can use data or the need for data centers to help us drive a green energy revolution, then why not? But at the moment, it is mostly still coal. So while we are moving up, it is there. The big thing is also that it's not just the data requirement that is going to change, it is also as temperatures go up, you're also going to start needing more and more energy, and you get into a point where the temperatures are so high that your energy coefficient of air conditioning systems that keep the data centers cool is going to be really difficult. So it's this constant battle. But I think there's definitely scope for big data and data centers to start push the green revolution. That does not take away the dangers of this electromagnetic smog that we are all in. And that's one of the things that maybe we should start thinking about. How are the ways that we can mitigate it, are ways to protect people about that or against that.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Sorry, Devin Pillay from LTM Energy. I think it's probably got this.
Mic's not working.
Sorry? Okay. Smart city seems to be a word thrown just very loosely these days, and everybody has a differing view of what's the definition of smart city. And to give you an example, I mean, how smart do you want to go? Recently,